I'm Dr. Allison Burke. I study the innovation economy and national security at Stanford University.
And I'm Brad Boyd, former soldier and visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. We love talking to really smart people about really interesting problems. In this series, we're going to introduce you to some of those people and take a snack-sized bite of hot issues in national security, foreign policy, emerging technology, climate, and information. Welcome to the Octagon. Today we're talking to our good friend Alicia Wanless, Director of the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
Alicia Wanless has been researching propaganda and information operations for over a decade and is down at Stanford this month discussing her work on Ukraine and the information environment. The last time I saw Alicia was when we were in Nagleicher's backyard discussing cybersecurity and social media. This time, we're heading to the British Bankers Club in Menlo Park to talk about Putin's information war supporting his invasion of Ukraine.
Do you think that there's any logic to, if I assert that part of the reason why there's a ground invasion right now, a physical invasion, is because Putin feels like he's lost the information war to keep Ukraine inside his sphere of influence?
So there may be something to be said that Putin does feel like he's lost. I think it's harder to say that concretely because I feel like in the West, we've really hyped up Russian capabilities when in many cases, I'm not sure that the activities they were doing was so sophisticated other than the hacking and leaking. The rest of their tactics seem to be pretty basic marketing techniques. However, if you look at Ukrainian sentiments, I think that his taking of Crimea did more to lose favor in that country than he had before. So if you look at some of the stats pre-2014, the country was pretty split in terms of which direction it should go. There never was an exact majority of whether it should go into the EU or whether it should go into the customs union that Russia was pushing, along with Belarus and others. And so it was split and there was no clear direction. And part of the issue was also that the Ukrainian elite hasn't exactly been so great for its own country. It's definitely been consistently out for itself, fighting amongst each other and trying to get rich. And so really you've got a lot of Ukrainian citizens who are lost in the middle. And so pre-2014, you had a fairly even split between which way they go. But Crimea pushed a lot of people away from Russia to the point where they really lost favor where they'd had it before. And the places where they maintained it were like Donbass, and they really weren't even holding that, nor did they ever have the popularity to be able to take it the same way they did Crimea.
Yeah, well, clearly the Russians, or Putin must think he's not doing well in his own country because he's really clamping down on people's ability to express themselves because he's obviously afraid they're not going to say what he wants them to say. So, I mean, he's estimating in his own mind, he must be, that he's not doing too well.
It's all hard to say, again, because we can't really measure it. And I think what's interesting to me watching Russia and Russians, as much as we can see now, is initially there were unprecedented protests in Russia against the invasion of Ukraine. There was also celebrities and some high-ranking officials who denounced it publicly. That's not normal. That's not usually what happens in Russia. Of course, now there's been a massive crackdown on that. They've shown how brutal they'll be. What's fascinating to me are how many people actually believe the official line coming out of the Kremlin. And so there's got to be some measure of success in that there are Russians who really believe that this is okay and that they're fighting Nazis, especially given the ties that are between those two countries. Russians have a lot of family members in Ukraine and vice versa. Like, it is like Canada and the US. It would be like the US invading my country. And so, it's crazy that it would even be popular. I don't think it's popular. I think there's a lot of people who dissent, but there are also a lot of people like these guys who are going around with Z on their shirt. And this is where the field has a massive problem. We don't really know whether they're effective or not. A lot of the academic research around influence operations and then tactics like disinformation tends to be on traditional mass media, not on digital media. We know very little about the effects of it there. And the second thing is whether you're intervening on it, we know even less in that regard. Princeton looked at 223 studies for us, and most of it was on things like fact-checking, pre-bunking, disclosure. We know next to nothing about deplatforming or any of those things. So our understanding is actually pretty weak. I would quip and have in the past that our understanding of influence is pretty much where medicine was in the Middle Ages. Somebody gave you the stink eye and you got sick. Somebody ran a campaign and it caused X to happen because they happened at the same time.
Do you think that internally platforms kind of know more than they're allowing researchers to know in terms of the benefits or spread of, quarantined information?
would guess that the research that's being done is usually at a product level. So it's not necessarily studying, adversarial threats the same way to see whether, they're having an effect or not. Also, it's very difficult to measure the effects of an adversarial campaign, because you don't necessarily know why they're doing it. You can't do A/B testing on it. You can't see whether one thing they did, led to a different impact or not. So it's really difficult to get to that kind of measurement. You can do more on interventions. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I don't know. This is a big issue in general. We need more transparency to understand their operations, what kind of research they're conducting, what that means, who's getting access to what.
Well, so as far as all of this stuff that's coming out from Ukraine and so forth, whether it's being picked up, what are some of the countermeasures that are being done, and is any of that useful, or is it just a bunch of nonsense?
That would be really hard to say, because one would need to be doing measurements on it.
Well, what are people thinking? I mean, something not being effective has never stopped anyone from doing stuff before. They usually fall back into the something must be done, this is something, let's do it. So what kind of stuff is that, and what's the problem with that?
Yeah, so typically, so I'm just finishing up my PhD thesis, as you know, and it looks at the information environment and conflicts throughout history to try to build a theory. And one of the things that stood out to me is that we consistently, as humans, reach for the heaviest, bluntest objects to try to deal with informational problems. We don't like disinformation, censor it. We don't like it, take away the tools, don't let them have access, and we try to control the information environment. It doesn't seem that ever really works out, but here we are, we're doing it again, and we're gonna keep doing it, because apparently humans don't learn and we just keep doing the same things. So in this context, there were a few things. The companies continue to try to apply their policies and update their policies as they go, which is typically how they've done things in the past as well. Don't know whether that's working or not. Many of the governments decided that their solution would be to press companies to do more, including banning Russian officials and state media. To me, that was just the last card that Putin wanted, because that allowed him to then take the platforms offline in Russia, which was also the key way which Zelensky was able to reach Russian audiences and try to appeal to them to say, please, don't do this. And some very emotional and in Russian pleas, right? So now we've cut that off. Russia, rather, has cut that off, but I think that trying to ban Russian officials and state media just sped that up. There's nothing to say that he wasn't going to do that eventually, but that is something that he wanted, and we gave him the ability to do that. It wasn't a solution. That's a temporary fix in my mind. There were other efforts like the USG that started sharing more intel and trying to do the pre-bunking that I was mentioning earlier, which is like one of the few things that there is some evidence on. That made it a lot harder, I think, for Russia to then come out, at least in the West, and possibly with other countries that among the UN agree that these pretexts were not viable. So there is some argument to be made there. I think I'm a little concerned that there has not been, or it doesn't appear that there has been great coordination between different stakeholders who, let's say, govern or affect certain parts of the information environment. And by what I mean there is like working with industry, governments working with industry, civil society who's doing a lot of the investigations. I don't see a whole lot of coordination there, and that's problematic because it's very piecemeal and fragmented. How do we have strategy if we can't actually bring the component parts together? Now, we want to be careful, because I'm not sure anybody really wants the governments telling the companies to do certain things beyond, regulation that would be beneficial for democracy. Nobody really knows what that would be. We don't really think that through. We lack the details for that as it is. And again, I come back to, I'm not sure that censorship is the answer. It hasn't worked in the past. I don't think it's going to work going forward.
Something that I've been thinking about is that it's better from a research perspective, obviously, to not censor, to not remove disinformation, but to quarantine it, to limit its shareability and limit its spread. And we've seen some results on Twitter and Reddit particularly, where we see that when they do that, it does limit the spread. People don't then create new accounts, or if they do, they create new accounts in easily traceable ways. Is there any reason, from an information theoretic or strategic standpoint, not to just quarantine everything and rather than remove it?
I mean, I haven't heard arguments about it either way, both inside companies or elsewhere. I would agree that that would probably be a more sensible approach than trying to deplatform or block entirely, because there is some evidence emerging that deplatforming only pushes people off to other areas. Censoring it entirely and blocking it doesn't get rid of the people who have believed that. It doesn't suddenly change their mind. And in some ways, making it inaccessible makes it more credible, more desirable because of the scarcity heuristic, right? And it also feeds into conspiracy narratives where the real rabbit hole is here, that there is some sort of government conspiracy or corporate conspiracy that's keeping people from accessing some type of information. So, I mean, I think it should definitely be explored. As with any of these interventions, I would love for them to be better studied, ideally with access to platform information to be able to do A/B testing and know what's happening. But until we get to that kind of level of study, we'll never know.
Can I throw one out there? What's always been compelling to me about sort of countering undesirable information out there, disinformation, what have you, is narrative. And what I find interesting about the Ukraine war as far as narrative is that the stuff that is coming out of Russia, most of the West seems to be fairly well defended against that narrative, because the Western narrative is that Russia is the traditional enemy, and the actions in Ukraine just reinforce that existing narrative. So it's almost like no matter what Russia says, most of the West is never going to abandon this 70-year narrative that we've had, at least not over the course of a couple of years. I mean, it would take decades. I've found that sort of narrative argument to be compelling as a defense against disinformation. What do you think about that? And is that valid? Are there problems with that?
And you think that's why they're bringing up Nazis? Because that's the one context in which there's an older enemy, and Russia was
exactly, Allison, exactly. You can attack the Western narrative by bringing up Nazis, because the West also, the even higher classification of enemy than the Soviets or the Russians are the Nazis. Everybody agrees that they're terrible. Even Russia and the United States agree that they're terrible.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's attacking that narrative.
Brad, I think there might be something to that, right? That Russia has been the enemy and an aggressor, and now we have such an interconnected information environment, and we have so much coverage coming out, even personal, from people's phones. Ukrainians are multilingual. They speak English very well. A lot of them do, right? So they're able to get their message out to a Western audience a lot faster, a lot more clear than, say, unfortunately, people did in Syria.
So no show is complete without some sort of requirement for prediction or forecasting. So if we're looking at Ukraine, Russia, the West, China, and the current information environment, the war in Ukraine is kind of a catalyst for change, right? And so I would expect not only the geopolitical situation to change, economic situation to change, but of course the information environment's going to change. So how is the information environment going to change through this conflict, and what do you see happening over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so I think what we're going to see is a lot more clamping down. So you'll have more digital sovereignty, like China, like Russia, where they kind of close off their own information ecosystem. I think if we don't get smarter in the West, those are going to be our responses too. They already are. That's what I was talking about earlier, is that if Putin was the master strategist that he was, all of that activity in 2016 and beyond was to get us to react and overreact so that we close down our own information ecosystems and have our own digital sovereignty. And I think that has played out in many ways, right? Like trying to ban Russian actors from being able to communicate to us because they're lying is a form of digital sovereignty. It is cracking down and taking things off. We have not developed better ways to really cope with information pollution and bad actors in our spaces. So until we kind of come to grips with that, and fundamentally that means having an open conversation of what the role of influence means in democracy, and that too much of it takes away the agency of people to make free and informed decisions, even by our own actors. And that fundamentally puts into question the very basis of democracy and its legitimacy. So until we have that kind of a reckoning, articulate some principles for how we should be engaging in the information environment, and then starting to understand how it actually functions and works to intervene, we run the risk of making the same choices.
Thanks to Alicia Wanless, Director of the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And thanks for watching. Join us next time when Dr. Herb Lin joins us to talk about important cybersecurity lessons we can learn from our pets.